story begins 2,400 years ago. Our hero is a familiar name, Plato. After writing his famous dialogue on the state, Plato wanted to take the concept of the ideal state he had conceived there a step further. He wonders how this wonderful model of society would work in real life. So he writes two dialogues, Timaeus and Critias. These date from around 360 to 355 BC. In other words, they were written after the state was established. Plato tells a story in Critias. Socrates, Timaeus, Critias, and Hermocrates gather together. Critias begins to recount an interesting story he heard from his grandfather. "Listen, friends, I'm going to tell you something very interesting," he says. "I heard this story from my grandfather Critias. He learned it from our famous lawgiver Solon. Solon once traveled to Egypt. While conversing with an elderly priest in the city of Sais, the priest said to Solon, 'Ah, you Greeks, you are all children. There is no elderly Greek among you.' When Solon asked why, the priest replied, 'Because you have no knowledge in your souls from ancient times. We have thousands of years of knowledge stored in our temple writings. One of these pieces of knowledge is about Atlantis.' The Egyptian priest speaks of a civilization that existed approximately 9,000 years ago. Beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which is today's Strait of Gibraltar, there was a huge island in the ocean. This island was called Atlantis and was home to a magnificent civilization. Plato describes this island in detail through the words of Critias. Under the protection of Poseidon, this island was arranged in concentric circles by the sea god. There was a hill in the center surrounded by rings of water and land. People built grand palaces, erected magnificent temples, and developed advanced irrigation methods. The Atlanteans were originally virtuous people. Their divine side prevailed, but over time wealth and power corrupted them. Greed and pride took root within them. Eventually they attempted to conquer the entire Mediterranean region. Only Athens stood against them, and it was precisely at this moment, while the Athenians were fighting heroically, that nature intervened. Major earthquakes and floods struck within a single day and night. Both the Athenian army was destroyed, and the entire island of Atlantis sank to the bottom of the sea, thus giving birth to the millennia-old legend of Atlantis. Before delving deeper and discussing why a large number of people still believe in this story today, let us say this. As most historians agree, Plato is not referring to a real place when he mentions Atlantis. He is telling this story as a parable, as a symbol used to speak of utopian communities, the rise of humanity, its arrogance, and its fall. But the idea of an advanced civilization that once existed in the middle of the Atlantic would not easily fade away. Especially when Europeans began exploring the world in the 1500s, many explorers secretly hoped that one day they would encounter a lost civilization similar to Plato's Atlantis, possessing valuable resources and advanced technology. But the strange thing was that the real explosion of the idea of Atlantis would come with the rise of science. In the 1600s, when Europe discovered the science of the East and started its own scientific revolution and tried to build a worldview based on evidence, explorers came across many lost cities that were previously considered to be MITs, and these cities were considered myths. But look, we found it, so there must be other lost cities. The idea of Plato's Atlantis began to dominate. For example, the city of Troy, located on our soil, was mentioned in the Iliad. However, its authenticity was confirmed in 1870 when Heinrich Schliemann began excavating at Hisarlik Hill, or cities like Machu Picchu and Petra. These gave explorers confidence. Atlantis would be found one day. One of the new perspectives provided by science concerned the age of the world. Until then, the prevailing view, based on sacred texts, was that the world and civilization were much younger. However, plate tectonics, continental drift, and fossil discoveries revealed that geography was actually much more dynamic. There was also the cultural aspect. It varied greatly in different parts of the world. Civilizations that had no chance of communicating with each other showed very similar developments during the same periods. The Egyptians and the Mayans were building similar structures at opposite ends of the world. They were developing writing systems. How could you explain this? This is where the idea began to make a lot of sense. What if there was a much older and more advanced civilization that was the source of all this ancient knowledge? A lost civilization that influenced all civilizations between the new and old worlds? If this is indeed Platoon's Atlantis, then here is where William Scott Elliot comes into play, the man who has been instrumental in Atlantis being taken so seriously today, and the belief that it will still be found one day. Scott Elliot was an amateur cartographer and drew maps, but he had one characteristic that made him particularly important. He was both a follower and a spiritualist. A person who believed in ancient narratives and legends, and believed that he could prove this with science, and who also adopted the fact that the continents were moving, would depict Atlantis on the world map he drew on the world map of today. According to the map he shows, about 1 million years ago, the continents of the world were in a very different position, and in fact a different landmass could be mentioned. A great giant continent, the legendary continent of Lemuria. This was the continent where Atlantis was found. This continent was then flooded by a great catastrophe some 800,000 years ago, and the world became what it is today. Atlantis became a burial ground on which this new world rose. Scott Elliot didn't stop with the map. He wrote about this map and Atlantis in a very detailed book. It's called Atlantis and the Lost Lemuria. In this book he described Atlantis in a very specific way, the structure of the city, the life there. Based on what? Plato's descriptions, scientific evidence that made sense to him, and of course his imagination. According to him, Atlantis was a circular city. With a huge palace in the center, there was a very complex canal system that managed the city water. At its peak, it was a city of 2 million people. These people were of the Atlanta race with special abilities and powers. Flying warships, ships powered by captive matter. They had access to some kind of energy source in another dimension that was beyond our understanding of physics. The energy in this different dimension was the crucial part. The Atlanteans were a race that had access to this energy and could use it for both good and evil. They write on metal plates. They drink hot, fresh blood from animals. They have bombs that release poisonous gases. They had a system in which all people, men and women, were equal. According to sources, we are talking about 90,000 years ago, before humans even started farming and domesticating animals. So modern man was 1 million years behind the Atlanteans. But here, 800,000 years ago, the world entered a great ice age. Then, with the following disasters, the ocean levels rose and the continent of Lemuria was gradually submerged. And finally, only the island that Plato referred to as Atlantis remained. And Scott Elliot gave a very specific date, saying that the island of Atlantis was also flooded in 9564 BC. This date was not actually a coincidence. When Scott Elliot gave this date, he also based it on sacred texts, pointing to the date said to be when Noah's flood occurred. With Noah's flood, Atlantis would be submerged underwater. But the claim does not end there. According to Scott Elliot, the Atlanteans did not perish along with the island. Just before the flood, they set sail east and west. They brought all their accumulated knowledge of advanced technology, engineering and architecture to the people of the East and West. The fact that the beginnings of agriculture and civilization also coincided with these dates naturally formed a convincing argument in people's minds. Around 10,000 BC, this was also when Göbekli Tepe was first established. Scott Elliot didn't stay here either. Scott Elliot provided a logical explanation for the racist viewpoint of Europeans during the colonial period, claiming that an advanced race that escaped from Atlantis was the Aryan race. This idea stemmed from the prejudice that people seen as backward could not build great civilizations. Eliot's detailed maps made this narrative more believable, but the idea then went to darker places, such as Heinrich Himmler and Nazi ideology. Today there is no scientific evidence that Atlantis existed or that there was an advanced race there. It is more a story of myth and fiction. The real issue is perhaps that humanity has a hard time believing in its own potential. What we don't want to accept is maybe the potential of humanity. I don't know if the idea that we can build the pyramids, the wonders around the world, the science, the technology, I don't know if it's too far-fetched. Until we meet again, as always, I'm glad you are here. Love.